In this world, hatred never ceases from hatred. By love alone does hatred cease. This is the law, sometimes a translation of the word dharma. This is the law, the truth, the teaching, ancient and eternal. So the Buddha was a peacenik. He was someone who taught love in the face of hatred, in the face of violence. It's not always so well known that the time of the Buddha was a time of tremendous violence. It was a time of tremendous cultural upheaval when local tribes and clans were being taken over by greedy kings mostly. And that process was one in which there was a lot of bloodshed. I'll read you a description from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who Saiva mentioned is the Buddhist scholar and has been himself a longtime peace activist. He says, in the century preceding the birth of the Buddha, Northeast India, where the Buddha lived, underwent sweeping transformations that profoundly reshaped the region's geopolitics. Older tribal states gave ways to monarchies ruled by ambitious kings who competed for dominance, leaving behind trails of blood and tears. The Buddha's native land, the Sakyan state. So some of you know the term Shakyamuni Buddha. Shakya was the clan that the Buddha came from, the Sakya clan. So the Sakya state, the clan that the Buddha came from, became a tributary of the kingdom of Kosala, which is actually a kind way of saying that the Kosalas conquered the Sakyas, that the Buddha's own people were actually decimated by the Kosalas. Bhikkhu Bodhi goes on to say, late in the Buddha's life, the cruel king Vidudaba. So for a long time, there was relative peace between the Sakyas and the Kosalas, but the Kosalas wanted more power, and the Sakyas wanted to stay within themselves. And they did a kind of trick with the Kosalas, that they married off one of the women from the Sakya clan to a royal high up person in the Kosala clan who was a slave, the woman who was married off. But they pretended that she was not. And in the very rigid caste system in India, this was considered a tremendous insult. And when that insult came to light, this cruel and insulted, angry king, Vidu Daba. Now I'm going back to Bhikkhu Bodhi. It says this cruel king Vidu Daba, the rogue ruler of Kosala, massacred the Sakyans, leaving few survivors. So the Buddha's own people were massacred. And in the face of that, the Buddha continued to preach, to wish for, to encourage love over hate. This cycle of violence, of revenge, of hatred has gone on for a long, 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 long time. And for those of us, especially those of us closely impacted by the violence in the Middle East, these cycles of violence predate the Buddha. This tribal conflict goes back 6,000 years. And so any effort to try to untangle, to try to understand, to try to lay blame, especially at the feet of the current leadership of Israel or Hamas, I suggest to us all is folly. That it is wiser in the spirit of the Buddha's teachings to allow ourselves to grieve rather than getting caught in cycles of blame. So I thought I would share a story also from the Buddha, which you may hear some echoes of what's happening in our world today, in which the Buddha demonstrates some of what this might look like. And if I have time, I will also share a story of one of the early Buddhist nuns and her effort to stop, to cut the chain of hatred and violence. So some of you may be familiar with the story, maybe partly historical, partly mythological story of Angulimala. Angulimala was a mass murderer who lived at the time of the Buddha. In our current vernacular, we might refer to him as a terrorist. he terrorized the countryside, killing people. And I think it's helpful to know a little bit of the backstory of Angulimala, because he didn't start out that way. He started out as a seeker. He came looking, seeking teachings of that would alleviate his own suffering. And unfortunately, he got tangled up with a teacher at the time whose own ego, whose own lust for power, whose own jealousy caused him to begin to distrust his student. And so he sent him out with this task to prove himself by killing 100 people. And Angulimala, being a good student, did his teacher's bidding. The name Angulimala refers to the necklace that he wore, which was a mala, a necklace, anguli of fingers of his victims. It's a disgusting, vivid image of cruelty. Just as many of us are being bombarded by horrific images of violence every day. And it's said that Angulimala terrorized the country, that he went from village to village and people fled in fear of their lives. And at some point, Angulimala's own mother decided that she would try to stop her son. And the Buddha, who saw this unfolding and recognized that the Angulimala's own mother could have become his 100th victim. He had already killed 99 people. Intervened. He saw with his wisdom eye, and he stepped in between Angulimala and his mother. And Angulimala's vision went from this possibility of killing his own mother to the Buddha. And there's this scene that unfolds in which it's described that Angulimala takes off, chasing the Buddha, prepared to kill him. And the Buddha continues slowly, mindfully carrying on as he had. And Angulimala keeps chasing and begins to get very frustrated because he cannot catch the Buddha. And he shouts at him, "Stop!" because he wants him to stop so that he can kill him. And the Buddha turns to face Angulimala and says to him, I have already stopped Angulimala. Now you stop. And because the Buddha is the Buddha, this is enough for Angulimala to recognize his folly, to feel the weight of the many lives he has taken, to feel great sorrow and repentance, and to convert and become a disciple of the Buddha. So the Buddha agrees to ordain him as a bhikkhu, agrees that despite his past life of crime, of hatred, of murder, that it's possible for him to transform. And so he ordains him as a bhikkhu. And interestingly, the story doesn't stop there. Because then, as a bhikkhu, Angulimala goes out into the countryside. Now, instead of murdering people, he is begging. And he goes village to village, and people who recognize him hurl rocks at him and clods of dirt. And he comes back from his alms round hungry, bloodied, despairing. And he goes to the Buddha, Angulimala goes to the Buddha to complain, to share his upset. And the Buddha does not go to the people in the countryside and say, would you please stop throwing clods of dirt and rocks at my disciple? He says to Angulimala, you must bear it. I've thought about this for a long time. And it seems to me that what's being said is that while it is entirely of us to transform our own unskillful, unhealthy, even murderous karma, that it is not possible for that transformation to mean that we are not still living in the wake of the unskillful things that we may have done. And that this paradoxical, complex truth could be useful for us just about now as a way to meet the complexity of the situation that we're facing now. Transformation is possible, and yet we cannot necessarily prevent the unfolding of karma. We will do our best to, as the Buddha suggested to Angulimala, stop, to cut the chain, to stop it from continuing. This is wise. But that even if we do, it doesn't mean that there won't continue to be harm done, that there won't continue to be people upset, that there won't continue to be violence. So we do our best. There is another story that I'd like to share that says something similar, but from a different perspective. And this is comes from the story and the poem of awakening. Letting some people in. This comes from the story and the poem of awakening from Upalavana. Upalavana was one of the Buddha's two great female disciples, Upalavana and Kema. Um, and Upalavana's story, her own story, is told in a text called the Therigatha, which is the earliest known text recorded of women's spiritual experience. And it's the text that records 73 poems of awakening that were recorded over a period of time of 300 years. So it was written down slowly and over time. These disciples of the Buddha sharing their songs of awakening, these women. And I will read you a poem, a piece of the poem from Angulimala, I'm sorry, from Upalavana. Upalavana was the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Savatthi, and there were many people, other wealthy merchants perhaps, who wanted her father to give them her hand in marriage because of her great, as these stories always go, because of her great beauty. The word Upalavana, just as the word Angulimala meant a garland of fingers, the word Angulimala, words, the word Upalavana, her name means dark blue lotus, and it referred to the blue-black color of her skin. It was a deep shade of brown. And because there were so many suitors, her father was afraid that basically, no matter what he was going to do, whoever he gave her to, somebody was going to be pissed off. So he decided instead that he would allow her, as she wished, to become a bhikkhuni, to enter the holy life and become a disciple of the Buddha. So she did. However, it turned out that despite her wishes, despite his best interest, despite all of that, despite Upalavana became known as the one foremost in magical powers. She was something. And despite all of this, one of her prior spurned suitors comes to her, according to her poem of awakening, and accosts her as she is practicing alone in the woods in a hut. I'll read you a bit of her poem. This is a translation of it from Maddie Wangas version from The First Free Women, and she says, or his translation of what she says. She says, then one night, while I was meditating in the woods, I was grabbed from behind. This sal tree is in full bloom, the man said. And here, lying beneath, I find a sal flower with a lovely shaved head. Tell me, my little flower, aren't you afraid? Excuse me for saying, but this asshole is taunting her. This sal tree is in full bloom, the man said, and here, lying beneath, I find a sal flower with a lovely shaved head. Tell me, my little flower, aren't you afraid? I bet she was afraid. Anyway, she goes on. I turned around. He looked just like my father. It would have taken so little, a flick of a finger, to make him burn. She was, remember, the one foremost magical powers. I looked into his eyes and saw billions of lifetimes that he and I had been running around together, this same circle of violence. Then I walked all the way down to the darkest parts of my own mind and stood in front of the blazing roar of countless lifetimes. Of countless lifetimes of fear and revenge. Does this sound familiar? Of countless lifetimes of fear and revenge, and I threw them onto the furnace. Then she goes on. Ask the lizard how long this has been going on. Ask the sunflower and her million seeds. The mind is more powerful than you can possibly imagine. And so I imagine, because it's unclear exactly from what happened, that Upalavana, like the Buddha and Angulimala, cut the chain of karma, of violence, and in this case, sexual violence that has been going around and around and around for millions of years. So it is possible for us to do that. It is possible for us to stop. But it requires going down, as she says, down to the darkest parts of my own mind. It requires us to come to grips with the millions and millions and millions of lives that have been lost and for the aeons and aeons in which the same behavior has repeated itself again and again and again, and to finally say, no, no, stop. I'm not going to keep it going. I'm not going to keep repeating the cycles of hate. So when the Buddha suggests to us that we replace hatred with love, I don't think he means that we replace hatred with some kind of squishy pink hallmark version of love. He's asking us to do something actually much more difficult. He's asking us to cultivate a quality of love that can say no, a quality of love that can say, stop, don't do it. This is so hard. I keep thinking this, there's this beautiful line from Dr. King, who said, power without love is reckless and abusive. Power without love is reckless and abusive. What are we sitting in the middle of? Power without love is reckless and abusive. Then he goes on to say, and love without power, the Hallmark version, is sentimental and anemic. Love without power is sentimental and anemic. And I propose to you that neither the Buddha's love nor Upalavana's love that said, stop, no more, that this kind of love was not sentimental, was not anemic, that it was very, very strong, that it was filled with Dharma, that it was able to infuse these chains of karmic unfolding of violence with instead clear seeing Dharma. So hard. So this is now confession. If I knew how to do that, if I could tell you now this is what we do, I would. But I don't. The best I can do is share some stories and to hope that you, like me, find like even a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of solace in them.